We've all encountered, at some stage, that feeling of losing or indeed gaining an hour or two, but imagine, just for one moment, arriving home only to discover your most familiar surroundings have entirely disappeared, replaced by buildings and people alien to you. This is the curious phenomenon known as time slips, a fascinating topic we've looked at previously, but with so many captivating yet unnerving cases, we've felt compelled to explore further, delving into their baffling world. We begin with an alarming account from a group of British friends, two sets of married couples, enjoying a joint anniversary celebration in France during the late 1970s. The group encountered a series of peculiar events on arriving. We've been to France as a foursome regularly. We'd often rent a beautiful house for a week or two to escape the usual hustle and bustle of the daily grind. One evening, whilst sharing drinks in the pub, the atmosphere seemed radically different. People looked at us with, I suppose you might say, suspicion. We've been here so many times before and never experienced anything like it, but we shrugged it off so as to not let it spoil our evening. Minutes later, a glamorous woman in an old-fashioned dress, the type my great-grandmother would have worn, walked in, causing me to squirm somewhat. Things felt very off. I can't explain it. The air just felt different somehow. As the evening went on, events continued to grow stranger still, when two police officers wearing unfamiliar uniforms, as though from decades before, came in for drinks. There was just an overwhelming sensation, an intuition that something was awry. My husband went to the bar for more drinks and, on paying the slightly hostile bartender, looked at him as though he'd walked in with three heads. "You can't pay with this," he scoffed, unamused. This grabbed the attention of the officers, who eyed my husband up and down as though he was a common criminal. They spoke with the bartender. I speak limited French and couldn't make out what was being said. And after ridiculing him and examining our currency as though it was ancient Grecian, they threw us out. We got in the car and barely said a word. We were all thinking the same thing, that we'd somehow slipped through time and wandered into an old tavern. As if matters weren't confusing enough, when we arrived back at our cottage, it was gone. All that stood in its place was a derelict old barn and overgrown farmland. We couldn't believe our eyes. Something happened that day. We stumbled upon an age gone by. There's simply no other way to explain it. A disconcerting episode, certainly, and one that with 4 impeachable witnesses proves an onerous task to doubt or challenge. Another startling account provided by a lady in Hampshire, England, shares eerily similar traits. I was born in Emsworth and loved the place dearly. I moved away before this happened, and as a mature woman of 62, have had to drastically alter my belief system since this occurred. After my husband John died, I relocated from Emsworth to be closer to my daughter. It gets frightfully lonely rattling about in a big house on your own, and it felt as though John was still there, which went from being a comfort into a great source of sadness to me. I knew, no matter how deep the hurt, I had to let go, or the grief would claim me also. I sold the family home and moved to Sussex. A few weeks later, after I'd began to settle into my new surroundings, I found myself searching for my engagement ring. I couldn't find the wretched thing anywhere, and the obsession with finding it intensified as I scolded myself that I was content to just discard John and all we had, and it simply wasn't the case. Concluding that it must be at the old family home in Emsworth, I rushed to the car and headed back, where I hoped and prayed the new owners had discovered it and I'd have it back. Grief does very strange things to one's mind. The tiniest, most irrelevant things can become the most paramount in your life for no good, logical reason. Had John been alive, I can almost hear him telling me to stop my silliness. It's a mere ring, but my mind wouldn't permit, wouldn't give up the incessant nagging, so off I went. As I reached the top of my old road, everything felt disturbingly different. I don't know, colder, unwelcoming, almost as though the old place was rejecting the traitor who once lived peacefully here. I argued with myself as I turned into the road. Why do I get so damned emotional? I reasoned, blaming these foreign, mixed-up feelings on John's sudden passing. How I longed to have him back. As I drove down the road, I was agog at the change. Where were all the old houses and the little school? All completely gone, and in their place stood rows of new builds. I was dumbfounded, to say the least. Reaching my old home, I felt sick to see the house was no longer standing, but there was no new build, just a vacant plot with a metal fence securing it off. I looked around. I must have seemed hysterical, and God knows I was. People walked by, not a single face I recognised. I felt more anxious than I ever had in my life. I was shaking. Decades of happy memories fired like bullets all over the road. Tears poured from my eyes. I recall dropping my car keys in my panic. I have to confess, I was violently sick there and then. I can honestly say it was a truly hateful experience. I finally steadied myself sufficiently to drive home. I recall putting the classical music station on, and yet I couldn't hear it. Despite its playing, it was an almost dreamlike sensation. When I arrived back in Sussex, I had to sit down for an hour and try to rationalise my experience, but I couldn't. I rang my daughter and she hurried over. I'm sure she must have thought I was losing my marbles. Karen agreed to drive back to the old house so she could see for herself, and she'd call me from there. "Mum," she said in a puzzled, concerned tone. "The house is here. Everything's the same, except different cars in the drive. I've just seen Brenda. Brenda was our next-door neighbour." Karen spoke with the new owners, who kindly handed the ring to her. They'd wanted to return it but had no contact address for me. Karen didn't mention my remarkable story to the new owners. I'm glad, too. They'd have thought me barking mad. 2 weeks later, when I was more composed, Karen drove me back so I could see everything was okay with my own eyes. And to my amazement, it was. I know it sounds like the ramblings of a widow consumed with grief, but it wasn't. I know what I saw. Reports of people returning to their former homes only to be met with alien surroundings is a common theme from those who claim to have slipped through time. It's understandable to see why it affects people so deeply and as poignantly as it does. Our final story comes from a young man in Bedford, England. I was 23 at the time. My mum had asked me to drive to Nan's and drop off her shopping before I went to work, so I did. I drove the same route I knew like the back of my hand and turned into Nan's Road. Weirdly, as soon as I indicated, I felt a shiver down my neck like something wasn't right. I parked up and carried the shopping to Nan's door, pushing the keys into the lock, and they wouldn't fit. Had Nan changed to the locks without saying? It was definitely her house. Why would she do that? I dropped the shopping and knocked on the door, quite worried about Nan and what had compelled her to change the locks. Seconds later, a friendly African lady answered the door. I couldn't believe my eyes. "Where's my Nan?" I asked in a shaky voice. The lady tried to disguise her surprise at my question. She explained she'd lived there for 24 years. I could just see the hallway from the front step, and it wasn't Nan's wallpaper. It wasn't Nan's anything. I felt really queasy. I apologised and drove home, completely stunned and lacking any kind of explanation. What the hell was I meant to tell Mum? When I got back and told Mum what happened, she, predictably, went ballistic. She was petrified with worry. We got back in the car and drove once again, to Nan's old place. This time, as we drove up, the shopping bags still lying upturned on the steps where I dropped them, there was Nan, stood with a look on her face as if to say, "What the bloody hell are you up to now, Ryan?" I've never seen Mum so relieved, and Nan doesn't believe a word of it. In fact, nobody does, and I can't really blame them. If it hadn't happened to me, I'd think it was a load of nonsense myself. Before this happened, I had no idea what time slips were. With such intriguing reports continuing to flood in, we leave you with this question. How would you react if you became embroiled in life from another age? Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, but all the while, don't have nightmares.